So, now that we have at least a little bit of familiarity with the Old Norse language due to our previous lessons, we can now finally go into the actual grammar. And thus, we are looking at the verbs. And this will be over the course of the next few lessons, starting with this one. And already good news. Compared to Latin or ancient Greek, we do not have that many verb forms, and you will see why in just a moment. Beginning with the infinitives, because the infinitives ending almost exclusively in "a". For example, koma, bera, segja, vilja, hafa, gefa, lata, ritha. So, most of the verbs in Old Norse ending in "a" for their infinitive form, and this form is not being conjugated. Yet, of course, we have a few exceptions here and there, and of course, as it is the case so often, the verb to be, which would be vera, is, of course, irregular, because why not? Now, in Old Norse, we only have two verb tenses, present and past. As for future, we have a few ways of doing that. Either we are just using the present tense in the context, or we are using auxiliary verbs such as munu, which means shall or will. For example, ek munu fara, I will go. Or skulu, which also means shall. But of course, we also can simply use time expressions. For example, a morgun, which means tomorrow. As for the moods, we have the standard three moods: indicative, subjunctive, and imperative. Beginning with the indicative, that is the standard one, when something is real, or at least thought to be. For example, Ulfre var madre sva mikil och sterkare, et egi varo hans jafningjar. Meaning, Ulf was a man so big and strong that no one were his equals. And this is, by the way, from the Eggels saga. Next, the subjunctive, which is not real, doubt, uncertainty, as well as hypothetical. So, it is mostly used in dependent clauses, especially in indirect speech. For example, Fathier hans hefjer thad meld, at han mundi af hendi lata vuit, en herstein tekivith. Meaning, his father has said that he would transfer, basically let it go from his hand or give up, the farm, where Herstein to take it over. This is from Hönsar Þöris saga. And lastly, the imperative. Simple enough, it means commanding. For example, Håk thu, which means you must strike. And this is from the Islendinga saga. Now, onto the types of verbs, of which we have three. So, first, the copular verbs. Those are linking verbs, basically connecting the subject of a sentence to a subject complement. In Latin, we have something very similar as well. There we have the predicate noun plus the predicate verb. Both combined are the predicates. For example, in Old Norse, ek er maður, I'm a man. Here, the verb vera, which is conjugated to m, links ek, which means I, to maður, which means man. Then we have the auxiliary verbs, basically helping with periphrastical phrases. For example, the ways of talking about the future. Ek munu fara, I will or shall go. And lastly, the action verbs, the ones that are actually doing something, or did something, or will do something, maybe. And here we have two further categories. We have the transitive, expressing an action on something or possession. For example, gefa, to give, or äga, to own or possess. And those verbs always have a direct object, which is an accusative, by the way, a noun or pronoun that receives the action. For example, Haraldre konungr gav henni land. King Harald gave her land. Or hon a svärd. She has or possesses a sword. And then we have the intransitive. They do not take object, neither direct, which would be accusative, or indirect, which would be dative. For example, hon dog, she died. But hon dog man, she died man. This is clearly ungrammatical, because dea, which means to die, cannot take a direct object. Same goes for hjälja, which means to laugh. Hon hlär. She laughs. Hon hlär barn. She laughed a child, yet again ungrammatical, for the same reason. So, normally, a verb is either transitive or intransitive, but not both. But sometimes a verb can be both. For example, äta, which means to eat. For example, in transitive we have han åt, he ate. And transitive, which means we have a accusative object here, han åt kjøtt, he ate meat. And then we have the voice. Here we have active and passive, but also middle or so-called reflexive. And important to note here, active and middle as well as reflexive do have their own endings. Passive, on the other hand, is using periphrastic structure, using an auxiliary verb and the past participle. Now, with the active, the subject performs the action. With the passive, the subject suffers the action, which means the action is done to the subject. And as you can imagine, with the middle or reflexive, the subject does not only do the action, but is also the receiver of the action. And sometimes the middle or reflexive has also passive meaning. For example, skip busk, the ships are being made ready, literally meaning readying themselves. Now, let us look at the past tense. Here we have strong, weak, and preterite present verbs. You see, in Old Norse, verb build their past tense in specific ways and can be divided into the categories of strong and weak verbs, and a very small third type, the preterite present, which has features of both the strong and weak verbs. And you will see, when I say small group, it is really small. So, beginning with the strong verbs. The strong verbs distinguish present and past tense by changing their root vowel. The same system is also in Old English, and elements of this even survive in modern English. For example, the present tense of the verb to take, or takes, and it forms in the past tense, took. Here we have a change of the root vowel from take to took. Now, the weak verbs, they form their past by adding a dental suffix, which would be the, t, or the. For example, kalla, which means to call. In the past, kalavi. And yet again, even in today's English, we have ed in a lot of verbs in the past. For example, call, called. But also te, for example, dream becomes dreamed. Admittedly, this one is more common in the British English than American English, where it would be dreamed. Next, the preterite present verbs, which again show features of both weak and strong. And it seems to be that we literally only have 10, which are the following. A, with the infinitive äga, which means to own or to have. Kan, with the infinitive kunna, which means to know how to, as well as to be able to. And we have ma, with the infinitive mega. Here, that also means to be able to, as well as may. Then we have man, with the infinitive muna, which means to remember. Then, if you remember, we have moon, with the infinitive munu, which means shall or will, and is one of the auxiliaries we talked about earlier. The other one being skull, with the infinitive skulu, which again means shall or must. Then we have tharf, which has the infinitive furfa, which means to need. Then we have wait, with the infinitive vita, which means to know. Then we have with the infinitive unna, which means to grant or to love. And lastly, we have duk, with the infinitive duga. This means to be strong enough or be of use. So, as you can see, while being a very small group, those verbs are rather important and thus rather frequent. For example, ek skal sigla till Islands. I ought to sail to Iceland. Or ek a att sigla till Islands. I have to sail to Iceland. And lastly, for today's lesson, infinitives and participles. You see, Old Norse does use infinitives and participles quite a lot. So, infinitives are fixed, unchanging verb forms. For example, again, kalla, which means to call, and taka, which means to take. Those are infinitives, which you can notice with the final R at the end. And, as said before, they are not being conjugated. In modern English, we use the two infinitives, again, to call, to take. Old Norse does this as well, sometimes, but rarely, using at, which is the equivalent to. Then the participles, those are basically verbal adjectives. Those are adjectives derived from verbs, to be more precise. And here we have them in present, present participle, and past, past participle, and each having their own set of endings. For example, takandi, meaning taking. This is the present participle, and the ending andi is similar to the English ing. Then we have tekin, which means taken, and that is a past participle. Now, the present participles are rare in Old Norse and mostly used in special constructions such as far far till rav takanda, what should now be adopted as the course of action. And this is, by the way, from the Gisla saga. And then we have the past participles. Those are common. For example, varfar gerör till konungstekin och varfmar ageter. This is from the Krymnismal. And this means And then Geirrod was proclaimed, taken as, king and became a famous man. So, in summary, verbs are either strong or weak, with the exception of 10 preterite present verbs. And we have first, second and third person, singular and plural, not really in active, in use, dual, so no worries about that, at least for now. And we have present tense and past tense. The future is either being expressed with the help of auxiliary verbs, or with context, or with words that indicate time. For the mood, we have the basic three: indicative, subjunctive, and imperative. And for the voice, we have active, middle or reflexive, and passive. And again, passive is usually built with an auxiliary verb plus the past participle.